The morning I found out my mother had known for 3 weeks and said nothing. I was sitting in a hospital bed, with a drainage tube still in my side, and a get well card from my coworkers taped to the wall across from me. That was the moment I understood that some betrayals don't announce themselves. They just sit quietly in the room with you while you're trying to heal. My name is Simone, and I'm 32 years old. I worked as a registered nurse at a mid-size hospital in Mississauga, Ontario. I say worked because everything that happened last winter changed the shape of my life in ways I'm still figuring out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the accident. It was a Tuesday in November, around 6 in the evening. I was driving home from a 12-hour shift on the oncology ward, which meant I was already running on fumes and 2 cups of lukewarm coffee. The highway was wet. Not raining exactly, just that particular kind of damp that Ontario does in late fall where the road looks dry but isn't. I was merging onto the 401 when something went wrong with my brakes. I pressed the pedal and felt almost nothing. A faint resistance like pressing a sponge instead of brakes. I pumped it twice. Nothing. The car drifted into the barrier on my left, and then everything went sideways, and then I don't remember anything else until there were lights above me and a paramedic's voice asking if I knew where I was. 2 broken ribs, a punctured lung, a hairline fracture in my left wrist, and something the doctors kept calling blunt force trauma to my midsection, which sounds abstract until you're the one lying there with a tube helping your chest cavity drain properly. I was in the hospital for 11 days. My husband came the first night. He sat in the chair beside my bed for about 40 minutes, checked his phone twice, told me he'd called my parents, and left to pick up our daughter from his mother's place. She was 3 years old at the time. Her name is Zoe. She's the reason I need you to understand all of this clearly. My parents came the following afternoon. My mother walked in first. And I remember thinking how strange it was, that her face looked more composed than worried. She hugged me carefully, said she was glad I was okay, and then sat in the corner chair with her coat still on, like she wasn't planning to stay. My father stood near the window with his hands in his pockets. He said, "The car's totaled, I assume," and I said yes, and then we sat in silence for a while. I asked if one of them could take Zoe for a few weeks while I recovered. I couldn't go back to our apartment right away. My husband worked long hours in logistics and had just taken on a new route that kept him away 3 nights a week. I needed help. I couldn't lift Zoe. I couldn't manage the stairs with my ribs the way they were. I had medical follow-up appointments every few days. I was genuinely asking for help. My mother looked at my father. He looked at the window. She said they were in the middle of renovating the basement. She said the dust wouldn't be good for a toddler. She said maybe my husband's mother could extend things a little longer. I remember the way the fluorescent light above my bed hummed. I remember thinking I must be misunderstanding something. I said, "Mom, I just got out of surgery." And she said, "I know, and we're so grateful you're okay." Like I had been asking for gratitude instead of help. My father said nothing. They stayed another 20 minutes and then left. I lay there in that bed staring at the get well card from my coworkers. A nurse named Precious had written, "We need you back soon. The overnight team is a disaster without you." And I cried for the first time since the accident, not because of the pain, because of the quiet. My husband's mother kept Zoe for the first week. She's a kind woman, lives in Brampton, makes her granddaughter pancakes every Sunday. But she had her own health issues and couldn't commit to longer. So Zoe came to the hospital to visit me, which was actually beautiful, because a 3-year-old has no filter, and she climbed into my bed very carefully and put her cheek against my hand and said, "Mama, you smell like the doctor." And then she went back home with my husband, and I spent my evenings alone. It was on the 7th night that things started to shift in a way I couldn't ignore. My husband came to visit, and he didn't know I was awake. I had the curtain half drawn and the lights low. I'd been trying to sleep and couldn't. He came in, saw me apparently resting, and stepped back into the hallway to take a call. The door was ajar. I could hear everything. He was talking to someone and he was angry in that low, controlled way he has when he doesn't want to make a scene. He said, "I told you it wasn't supposed to go this far." Then a pause. Then, "The timeline changes everything now. She's going to be asking questions we can't answer." Another pause. Then, "Just talk to her parents. Make sure everyone's on the same page." He came back in about 10 minutes later. I kept my eyes closed. He sat down, checked his phone, and left after 15 minutes. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't say goodnight. I lay there with my ribs aching and my mind doing something it had never done before. Reassembling every small strange thing from the past year into a shape I didn't want to look at. The life insurance policy my husband had suggested we update 8 months earlier. Just being responsible, he'd said. The way he'd asked me twice in the spring whether I'd ever looked into what my grandmother's estate had actually included. The argument we'd had in September when I told him I wasn't interested in touching that money, that it was meant for Zoe's future. The way he'd gone quiet after that, not angry quiet but thinking quiet, which I now understood was different. My grandmother had passed 2 years before. She'd been a school principal for 30 years in Scarborough, careful and deliberate with everything she did, including her will. She had left her house, a detached home near Kingston Road that was worth considerably more now than when she'd bought it in the late 80s, to me, not to my parents. To me, specifically, with a note from her lawyer that she'd wanted to ensure the property passed to the next generation intact. My parents had been upset about this. They hadn't said so directly, but I'd felt it. There had been comments. There had been a particular silence at the estate reading that I'd filed away and never quite forgotten. My husband knew the house existed. He knew what it was worth. He knew my parents were bitter about it. And apparently, he knew their phone number well enough to coordinate with them, while I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my chest. When my uncle came, he came without calling ahead. He's my grandmother's younger brother. He's 71, retired, lives in a small house in Kingston, and drives a 10-year-old Buick that he insists runs perfectly. He'd heard about the accident from a cousin and had driven 3.5 hours. He walked into my hospital room on a Thursday morning with a Tim Hortons bag in one hand and his coat over his arm, and the look on his face when he saw me. That particular look that older people get when they see someone they love hurting, where their whole face just settles into grief without any effort to hide it. That look made me cry before he even sat down. He sat down. He handed me a blueberry muffin. He said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the breaks. I told him about my parents' visit. I told him what I'd overheard in the hallway. I told him about the insurance policy, and the questions about grandmother's estate, and the particular silence in my marriage that I'd been chalking up to stress for almost a year. I told him about Zoe's pancakes at my mother-in-law's house, and the get well card, and the fluorescent light, and the crying. I told him all of it. He listened the entire time without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother made me co-executor of her estate. Did you know that?" I did not know that. He said he had never mentioned it because there had been nothing to execute. The property had transferred cleanly, the accounts had been distributed. Everything had been settled. But he had a copy of the full estate documentation. And about 4 months after the estate was settled, my parents had contacted the lawyer, asking about whether the property transfer could be contested on grounds of undue influence. Essentially arguing that my grandmother had been pressured into leaving the house to me instead of to them. The lawyer had shut that down quickly. There was no grounds. My grandmother had been of fully sound mind and had signed everything in the presence of witnesses. But the attempt had been made, and my uncle had been notified as co-executor. He hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to cause a fracture in the family over something that had ultimately gone nowhere. Until now. He said, "I think you need a lawyer." I said, "I think I need to understand what actually happened to my car first." The police report on the accident had listed the cause as mechanical failure, brake fluid loss due to a compromised line. The assumption had been wear and corrosion. My car was 6 years old, I'd been overdue for servicing, and in Ontario winter the undercarriage of a car takes a real beating. It was a plausible explanation. It was the explanation everyone had accepted, including me, because I'd been too hurt and too overwhelmed to question it. But my uncle, who had spent 30 years as a mechanical engineer before he retired, said something I hadn't considered. A compromised line from wear doesn't usually fail that completely. That fast, it leaks. You'd notice fluid on the ground, or you'd notice the pedal getting softer over days. You wouldn't just lose brakes entirely on the highway. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. I called a lawyer the following week. She was recommended to me by a colleague at work, sharp, efficient, the kind of person who doesn't use 10 words when 3 will do. I told her everything, starting from the estate dispute and ending with what I'd overheard in the hallway. She listened carefully and then asked me 2 questions. Did I have documentation of the insurance policy update, and had I spoken to my husband about any of this since the accident? I said yes to the first. I said no to the second. She said, "Good, keep it that way for now." What followed was about 6 weeks that I can only describe as the slowest and most disorienting period of my life. I was recovering physically, slowly, with physio appointments twice a week at a clinic in Oakville, and more medical documentation than I'd ever accumulated in one place. I was staying at my uncle's house in Kingston, because there was nowhere else to go that felt safe, which he had offered immediately and without conditions. Zoe was with me. She loved his backyard. She called him the old man with the Buick, which he thought was hilarious. My husband had agreed to me staying in Kingston while I recovered, framing it as practical. I let him believe I was simply healing. My lawyer had advised me to keep the separation formal and undocumented for the time being. Meanwhile, things began to surface. The mechanic my uncle had hired, a former colleague of his, thorough and trustworthy, examined the police report photos and the salvage report from my car. He said the brake line showed signs of a clean cut near the junction, partially disguised by scoring consistent with road damage. It wasn't conclusive. It couldn't be conclusive, because the car had been in a barrier collision at highway speed. But it was enough to prompt my lawyer to request a formal re-examination through the insurer, which under Ontario insurance regulations, they were obligated to conduct given the circumstances. My husband, it turned out, had serviced my car 2 weeks before the accident. He'd taken it in himself, told me he was doing me a favor because I'd been working so many overnight shifts. He'd used a garage I'd never been to before, run by someone I didn't know. He had the receipt on his phone. He showed it to me once early in the hospital as a kind of accounting, see I do things for you, before I knew to pay attention. My lawyer got the records from that garage. The service record showed an oil change and a tire rotation, nothing involving the brake system, which meant either the garage had worked on the brakes without recording it, or someone else had. My parents, it came out later, had been in contact with my husband for almost 8 months before the accident. Not socially. They'd never been close. But over the estate, they had, apparently, reached an agreement in principle that if my husband could persuade me to sell the Kingston Road property and split the proceeds, they would receive 40%. In exchange, they would support him in any future dispute over assets, including a potential separation. There were text messages. My lawyer found them during the discovery process when my husband, underestimating how thoroughly she worked, had not deleted a thread from his secondary email account that he'd forgotten he'd synced to a shared cloud backup. The messages were specific. There was one from my mother sent about 3 weeks before the accident that said, "Things are moving slowly, we may need to look at more direct options." My husband's response was, "I'm handling it, just be patient." My mother's reply, "The window on this is not unlimited. Think about Zoe's stability." Like my daughter was a bargaining chip. Like her name in that sentence was normal. I read that message on a Thursday afternoon in my uncle's kitchen, while he was making soup on the stove and Zoe was asleep upstairs, and I sat there with my phone in my hand for a long time not saying anything. My uncle turned around and looked at my face and turned the stove off and came and sat across from me and just put his hand on the table, close to mine, without touching it. Just there. Eventually I said, "She used Zoe's name." He said, "I know." I said, "She's my mother." He didn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer that helped. The legal process was long. I won't pretend otherwise. Family law in Ontario is not fast, and when you're also dealing with an ongoing insurance investigation and a contested estate dispute that had been quietly revived, everything moved in layers that my lawyer had to manage simultaneously. There were months of documentation and depositions, and one very uncomfortable afternoon, where I sat across a conference table from my parents and their lawyer, and watched my father look at the table the entire time, and my mother looks somewhere above my left shoulder, and I understood that they had decided the strategy was to appear unbothered. It didn't work. The insurance investigation concluded that the brake failure was consistent with deliberate interference. This finding was forwarded to the Ontario Provincial Police. My husband was charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm. The Crown later stayed the charge related to the car specifically. The physical evidence, as the mechanic had noted, was not conclusive enough, but the investigation into the fraudulent insurance claim he had separately filed related to the accident opened a second charge, and that one held. He pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 18 months, served at a minimum security facility. My parents were not criminally charged. There was not enough direct evidence to connect them to the brake failure, and the text messages, while damning, established conspiracy to commit financial fraud, rather than conspiracy in the physical sense. They settled the estate dispute out of court. They paid my legal fees. I do not speak to them. My uncle came to every court date. He drove the Buick. He always had coffee. The Kingston Road property is still mine. It is currently rented to a young family, a couple, and their 2 kids who moved in last spring, and the income from that rental helps me cover Zoe's daycare costs while I rebuilt my hours at work. I went back to nursing in the spring. The oncology ward took me back without a second's hesitation, which I will be grateful for the rest of my life. Zoe is 4.5 now. She is in a junior kindergarten program at a school 3 blocks from our apartment in Mississauga, the same apartment I went back to alone after everything concluded. She has her grandmother's eyes, my father's mother, who died when I was in high school and who I think about more now than I used to. She makes up songs about her breakfast. She is the most specific person I have ever met. She sees her father's mother regularly, because that woman did nothing wrong and loves her granddaughter genuinely, and I am not willing to take that from either of them. We have a schedule. It works. She has asked about her father twice. Both times I have told her that he is somewhere he needs to be right now, and that when she has more questions, I will answer them as honestly as I can, and that none of it has anything to do with how much she is loved. She has both times accepted this and then asked if we can have waffles. I think she is going to be okay. I think we are going to be okay. My uncle called last week. He's thinking of doing some work on his house before winter. The back deck has seen better days, and wanted to know if Zoe and I wanted to come for a weekend to keep him company. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He laughed. I think about the accident sometimes. I think about that moment on the 401 when I pressed the brake and felt almost nothing. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd been going faster, or if the barrier had been at a different angle, or if the paramedics had taken a few minutes longer. I've thought about the fact that Zoe would have grown up with a version of events that her father and grandparents constructed, and that thought is the one that still wakes me up at 2 in the morning on bad nights. But I also think about my uncle driving his 10-year-old Buick 3.5 hours because he heard I was hurt. I think about him sitting in that hospital chair with a Tim Hortons bag and that look on his face. I think about him turning off the stove and putting his hand on the table close to mine. That's the thing about the people who actually show up for you. They don't announce it in advance. They just come through the door.